After 6 weeks of solo backpacking, 6 weeks of stepping into a new hostel every few days, not knowing anyone else, and then leaving that same hostel a few days later with new friendships but no certainty as to whether they'll stick with the passing of time and distance. 6 weeks of solo coffee dates and journaling sessions, 6 weeks of connecting with others, but more so with myself. I realized that to be alone is not to be lonely, and to be lonely, you don't need to be alone. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, Charlie Chats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. The term loneliness gets thrown around a lot these days. It's a crisis, an epidemic, a serious cause for concern for collective mental health. It's also used as an excuse for violence, bigotry, fueling further disconnect between individuals. But what is it actually? And what does it mean? The loneliness epidemic suggests that individuals are significantly more lonely than they have been ever in history. It suggests a crisis, that individuals are feeling more isolated than ever before, and that authentic connection is not commonplace at the moment. It suggests that collectively we're feeling more alone. Loneliness is linked with various health conditions as well. In fact, it's estimated that it can decrease life expectancy by 26%. And according to Dr. Vivek Murphy, it can increase conditions such as heart disease by 29% and the risk of stroke by 32%. The Campaign to End Loneliness has stated that people who are always or often lonely have a higher risk of developing certain mental health conditions, such as anxiety and depression. This kind of loneliness is also associated with increasing thoughts of unaliving themselves. There's no doubt that people are suffering in large numbers, but in order to address it, we have to understand what exactly it is that people are meaning when they say that they feel lonely. And as it turns out, the concept is actually really hard to pin down. Some studies quote generally higher levels of isolation as causing loneliness, while others quote that people are feeling lonely even when surrounded by others. But is isolation the same as loneliness? And how do we address this problem where people are clearly suffering, but what exactly from? Today we're unpacking the distinction between solitude and loneliness, and it's a little bit of a less scripted, chattier video because I'm actually going to be referring to my own journal that I wrote while I was away last year in Europe solo traveling. I was looking through my journal and I read a couple of articles recently in relation to loneliness, and I wanted to see whether or not that was something that I experienced while I was away, and lo and behold, it absolutely was. I wanted to use this video as a kind of hybrid reflection cross video essay where I unpack various articles that I've found and then also share my own personal experiences, because I thought that would be an interesting way to talk about this topic. And as you may soon notice, I've followed a slightly different editing style in this video to give you an insight into my travel so that you guys get that full HD 4K experience. You are basically there with me, you know what I mean? And so I really wanted to do the editing justice, but I actually find editing really hard and finicky. I think this might be partly because I've been doing my edits in such inefficient ways, which I recently found out when I took a Skillshare class on editing. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. A few videos ago I spoke about how I was taking Jordan Teresa's class on video essay making, which has really helped me hone down the skill of scripting and brainstorming. However, more recently I've been taking a class called YouTube Video Editing, Developing Your Signature Style, which has really helped me to figure out how to make my edits a little bit more streamlined. Hopefully it also makes for a more enjoyable watch for you guys as well. I'm a huge fan of making education more accessible, and if you are too, the first 500 people to use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And also, I want to give a massive shout out to the 2 articles that I quote quite frequently in today's video, which are by Faith Hill and Derek Thompson, both in The Atlantic. And another thing to say is that because these 2 sources came from The Atlantic that I'm using for the majority of this video, most of this video is kind of US centric. And I know majority of my viewers are from the US, but obviously take this with a grain of salt if you're not from the US. Generally, the US does kind of reflect at least politics and circumstances, cultures, trends in Australia and the UK at least. Putting that there as a bit of a disclaimer, I suppose. The Campaign to End Loneliness has defined loneliness as a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. It happens when there is a mismatch between the quantity and quality of the social relationships that we have and those that we want. It's a natural feeling that ebbs and flows across our lifetime, according to Joe Harrison, the campaign manager for the Marmalade Trust. Age has a lot to do with it. In fact, if you graph loneliness over someone's lifetime, there appears to be kind of a U-shaped curve with a peak in young adulthood, a trough in midlife, and then another peak again after 60 and usually at 80. For those in old age, loneliness makes a lot of sense. The loss of ability to do a lot of the things that we generally take for granted, then add in the loss of friends and loved ones, and it's not a surprise that people are spending more time at home on their own and with less social interaction. This can lead to feelings of isolation and invisibility, according to Ruth Lowe. In an article I read by Phil Doust, he actually quoted feeling the most connected to the world when he was 40 years old and living on his own in the mountains, despite the fact that he would go days without seeing people. And this really got me thinking that there must be some intrinsic difference between being alone and feeling lonely. Social isolation is more the disconnect from other individuals. It's more of an objective happenstance rather than a feeling or a perception. According to Faith Hill, some studies measure the time that people spend alone or the number of close friends that they have as proxies for isolation. Yet this isn't the same as loneliness, nor is it necessarily a good predictor for loneliness. She then quotes a review of literature which occurred in 2022 and says that many existing studies on loneliness are actually inconclusive. When I decided to go backpacking on my own, a lot of my friends and family asked why. Why would you do that? Why would you go alone? Why wouldn't you wait for your friends or your boyfriend or other people in your life to join you? I also had a lot of people saying that they could never do that themselves. Hilariously, I also frequently got that one word that everyone says that you are if they kind of don't understand why you're doing something, but they rate the dedication to the cause. Brave. But to be honest, going alone wasn't really ever my first choice. I had been inspired by other people who were solo traveling, particularly with a kind of wave of solo traveling influencers after the pandemic that I saw on social media. But going alone wasn't my first preference at all on this particular trip, let alone going on my own for 6 weeks. If I'm being totally frank, the reason I ended up going on my own was far more a selfish reason than anything else. I knew that I wanted to go traveling and it was a great time in my life to be able to pursue that, and it just so happened that no one else in my life was able to do it. So I just kind of went. But it wasn't easy. In fact, if I look at my journal, which let me just get from here. Sorry, I'm cringing myself out. I thought that was going to be really cool and it wasn't. Anyway, the first few days of my trip, I was in Prague, and my journal entry for that time reads as follows. I feel lonely. It's 10 p.m. and I'm basically packed for Budapest tomorrow. I have really enjoyed Prague, but I feel so antisocial and sad that I'm not with or making friends. I can't tell if it's this hostel or me, but either way, I'm just not used to this feeling of loneliness. It could even be that I need to get used to my own company or that I need to push myself and make some friends. But the thing is, I'm not 100% sold on those pub crawls, and they seem to be the main way of socializing here. I was both feeling lonely and alone. I hadn't connected with anyone yet, and I missed the people in my life back at home. But clearly there's also something else in there that I noticed in hindsight reading back on the journal, and that is a discomfort with myself. I seem to be uncomfortable with doing things on my own when the people in my life that I'm so used to sharing my experiences with and that I'm so used to defining myself in relation to aren't there. Last year, a KPMG and Groundswell report found that more than a quarter of Australians were impacted by loneliness, which is over 5 million people. A common scale to measure loneliness is the UCLA Loneliness Scale, which essentially asks how people feel about companionship in their lives. You rate how often you might feel excluded or how often it feels like there are people around you but you don't really feel connected to them. Unlike other scales which purport to measure loneliness but actually end up measuring social isolation or solitude, the UCLA scale actually looks at how people feel in relation to loneliness rather than an objective circumstance. Yet, according to Claude S. Fisher, who's a sociologist at UC Berkeley, the scale is often used in small sample studies and is rarely used over a longitudinal amount of time. In fact, in Faith Hill's article, she mentions that measuring loneliness over time is actually really hard to do because so often different studies use different scales or different thresholds for what's considered lonely, different definitions for what loneliness even means, and different understandings based on the research at the time as to what it is and how it impacts people. The notion that we're in a loneliness epidemic right now is often coupled with the idea that we're in greater periods of loneliness than ever before. The UK and Japan have both appointed loneliness ministers. And in 2023, the World Health Organization said that loneliness was a cause for major public health concern. But if we can't accurately track what loneliness really is over time, it might indicate that maybe we're using the wrong term, or maybe we need more data to explain what's going on here. In her article, Hill quoted the following: "The greatest difficulty with measuring loneliness and deciding how much to focus on ending it may be that we don't really know what loneliness is. Different people, researchers told me, seem to mean different things when they say they're lonely. Some want more time with friends, some yearn to be seen for who they are, and some feel disconnected from a collective identity or sense of purpose. What those experiences tell us about society's ills, or whether they tell any coherent story at all, remains unclear." When I look back on my journal, I can count 8 different occasions where I write about experiences that I would say conflate with some sort of feeling of loneliness. Some where I really was alone and struggling to connect with others around me, but also some where I was surrounded by people but didn't feel particularly connected to them. And these latter cases interest me quite a bit because it suggests that I was putting a fair bit of pressure on the friendships that I was making to give me more fulfillment and connection than, say, might have ever been possible. There's a lot of rhetoric online right now about having fewer friends that give you these all-encompassing relationships and all of your needs are met with a very few number of people. And I feel like this has really manifested in a way where we're talking about prioritizing the individual and the self and cutting off people who don't treat you right. And in no way am I saying you shouldn't ever cut off people for valid reasons, but it really feels like there's a huge emphasis on not investing your time in friendships that, air quote, don't serve you. In many ways and in many circumstances, this is a great testament to radical self-love and self-acceptance. However, I think it puts a lot of emphasis and value on the people who are closest to you in your life and highlights that those relationships are superior to those people in your life who you aren't as close to. It suggests that casual friendships or weaker tie friendships aren't worth investing in because they don't provide you enough return. In a study done by Mark Granovetter in 1978 called The Strength of Weak Ties, he found that the benefit of having a large quantity of friends, regardless of how weak in connection, can actually be really impactful on a person's mental health and well-being. Until this point, a lot of the research in sociology highlighted the value and benefit of a small, tight-knit circle. However, Granovetter found that for bringing new information and new ideas into your life, weaker tie friendships or casual friendships are actually more important. During the pandemic, and particularly during lockdowns, regular interactions with everyday people and casual interactions which gave rise to weaker tie friendships or relationships really diminished. I mean, your commute to work no longer passed a barista, a hot dog stand person. I love how I say that, and I'm like not living in New York, but maybe it's manifesting, okay? In fact, your commute was from your bedroom to your study, or sometimes from your bed to your desk in the same bedroom, and it's highly unlikely that you really saw many people while you did that. In a small study that was actually based on the researcher's weak tie interactions that she had with someone who worked in a hot dog stand, Gillian Sandstorm found the following. Participants with larger networks of weak ties tended to be happier overall, and that on days when a participant had a greater number of casual interactions with weak ties, they experienced more happiness and a greater sense of belonging. In Faith Hill's article, she says that while social interaction has changed over time, it doesn't necessarily mean it's gotten worse. In fact, Faye Bound Alberti, a historian of emotions, told her the following. In pre-industrial farming communities, people usually had to depend on whoever was around them, mostly family or neighbours, for support. That lack of choice was perhaps comforting, but also very restrictive. Yet as people started to move to cities, friendships changed entirely. You were suddenly able to seek out particular friends based on specific interests and wants. You suddenly had so much choice, and so friendships became more pure, and you had way more in common with your friends. Your friends became elevated in their position in your social networks and circles. And in fact, some quote this as being part of the reason for loneliness today. Some suggest that we're expecting so much from our friendships that we're feeling lonely when we don't have those all-encompassing relationships with people that share all the same values and humor and personality traits as we do. Initially on my travels, I actually found it kind of hard to connect with other people because I think I was expecting so much from those interactions. I mean, it's easy to expect that way when so many people who go solo traveling come back with stories of finding incredible relationships that they made along the way. And so the pressure felt really extreme to turn every random interaction to one life-changing one, to the extent where I was like, casual hello in the lobby isn't what I'm expecting. I expect more, you know what I mean? But the logic there is crazy because, as I soon realized, sometimes the casual hello in the lobby and the casual interaction is where the interaction starts and stops. But that still provides enough value to actually change the trajectory of your day that day, because that connection, as minute and small as it may be, as shallow and superficial as it may be, still brings you a level of happiness and joy that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't connect with anyone at all. The day after I wrote about my experience feeling lonely in Prague, I wrote this. On my way back to the hostel today, I managed to locate, accidentally, a vintage bric-a-brac sign and obviously followed it down the narrow street, finding the most ornate, crazily curated antique store I've ever seen. 20 clocks from different eras ticking at once. Pearl bags, Russian fur hats, scissors, mirrors, scarves, jewels, boxes, wooden things, dolls, beer warmers, ceramics, all of which belonged to someone in Czechia at some point. Just me and a Dutch couple potted around until the apparent owner, a friendly older man with white hair, appeared with a tray of 4 espressos in old Czech mugs. He then spoke to us about the different collections that he had over time, and then filled up my water bottle and told me the water here is really very good and that I really should stop buying bottled water. The American Time Use Survey found that leisure time spent in person with other people declined by over 20% between 2003 and 2023 in the US. Hill notes that even if you think that time spent physically together is superior, discounting remote hangouts entirely might give you a picture of American life that sounds more profoundly isolated than it really is. In another article by Derek Thompson for The Atlantic, he said that the share of US adults having dinner or drinks with friends on any given night has declined by more than 30% in the past 20 years. However, the article then goes on to quote that, according to data gathered by the online reservations platform OpenTable, solo dining has increased by 29% in just the past 2 years. And the number one reason for this is the need for more me time. This strikes me as quite interesting because when you frame solo dining as an experience that was elected by a person for me time or almost self-care, it doesn't look so depressing and bleak. In fact, it seems empowering. While I was traveling, one of my main goals was actually to be able to go to a wine bar on my own with my journal or a book, not go on my phone for that time, and to not feel awkward or embarrassed. Now, over time, I did eventually get there, but it struck me as quite crazy how negative the stigma I had in my head for solo dining was, and how I felt that I'd be so judged and that I would ultimately be judging myself for being alone at a restaurant or a wine bar, which is so silly. To actually enjoy myself on these solo dates, I needed to enjoy my own company, which, as it turns out, was something that I actually needed to practice. Perhaps this research, as demonstrated by OpenTable, suggests that a lot more people are starting to feel comfortable in their own solitude as well. And perhaps it's something that should be really celebrated. In fact, Derek Thompson's article even quotes a 2021 study which used the loneliness scale, which suggested that loneliness levels are actually flatlining or even declining, yet it's solitude that's surging. According to Eric Kleinberg, a sociologist at NYU, loneliness is actually a really healthy response. In fact, it's a biological cue to get you out and socializing with other people. I mean, humans are social animals. We need socialization to help us with various developmental stages of our lives and to help us get through hard things. Also, to just survive, we need other people too. Loneliness is actually good if you feel it sometimes. However, as noted in Derek Thompson's article, Americans don't seem to be responding to the cue in the way that they should be. Instead of going and socializing with other people in person, people are responding to the cue by microdosing, in my words, social interactions by going on their phones and going on social media. Social media gives you this illusion that you're socializing and interacting with others, but really you're just seeing what other people are doing and how other people are posting about how they're socializing with others. And it seems to actually just end up highlighting that you're more disconnected because while they're socializing and you're seeing it, you're on your own in your room or in your house. I think ruling social media out entirely, though, as a useful form of social interaction isn't really fair either, though. I mean, for me, on days where I felt particularly isolated or lonely while I was traveling, I found certain ways through communicating on social media to be extremely beneficial and give me that dose of human connection that I wanted. Sending voice notes or vlogs to my friends, or even posting things on my close friend's story that my friends could then react to or respond to. Using social media in some ways can definitely bring the feeling of connection, but doom scrolling, that's another story. This suggests that when studies look at face-to-face connection as superior than online connection, it may actually be missing a really crucial part of what's actually happening at the moment and how people are connecting and engaging with other people. But the thing is, if the data can't show really that the situation is getting any worse, then we can't say the opposite either. We can't say that the situation is getting better. And chances are, if a lot of people are reporting that they feel lonely, regardless of what they mean, it indicates that they're suffering in some way or another. You're unlikely to report feeling lonely if what you really mean is that you're feeling empowered to go on a solo date. It's very possible that solitude for enjoyment is on the rise, just as feelings of loneliness are too, and perhaps this is among two completely different groups of people. When I look back on those 8 occasions where I conflated it with loneliness now, sometimes sure, they were experiences of loneliness, but actually looking at it with some more critical thinking, I think a lot of those experiences were more a lack of confidence and self-acceptance in being on my own and doing things on my own. They suggest to me more a discomfort in myself and my own solitude rather than a feeling of a lack of connection to others. And I could even say that some of those occasions, in fact, most of those occasions, were a lack of connection with myself rather than with other people. When Faith Hill spoke with Richard Weisbord, I'm sorry, that's definitely not how you say his name. Anyway, a psychologist at Harvard, he said that in a survey of 1,500 Americans in 2023, which was conducted by him, 21% of the participants reported feeling lonely either all of the time or most of the time in the previous 30 days. Yet he was also able to gather the reasons why people actually quoted that they felt lonely, and they ranged quite significantly. Some participants reported not feeling connected with their country or their place, or that they didn't feel like their place in the world was important. Some said they didn't feel they could be authentic around others, and some said they didn't feel good about who they were. He then pondered whether these people might be also experiencing depression or anxiety, which is a very common situation for those experiencing loneliness. And in fact, what this really highlights to me is that we need more funding and resources going to mental health support in general, not just loneliness, particularly where there's a significant overlap between the two. When it comes to the conversation about loneliness in modern culture, there's actually a lot to be said about the spaces that we occupy and the environments that we exist in, and the architecture of those environments too. Specifically, there's been a significant decline in third places over the last few decades, which is a term which was coined by sociologist Ray Oldenburg to describe the places that we exist in which aren't our home, the first place, or our work, the second place. They typically refer to places like parks or malls or cafes. They've been associated with reducing stress and loneliness because it increases the chance of random interactions and the development of weaker tie relations with other people. In an article in Forbes, they stated that recently Starbucks has actually reversed its open door policy, meaning that no longer will people be able to go to Starbucks if they're not a paying customer. Now, in 2018, the development of the policy was based on gaining and improving inclusivity in third places, particularly where third places were on the decline. And third places were declining prior to the pandemic as well. Recently, the reversal of this policy has been quoted to be associated with safety and concerns around making the place a safe space for those who are patrons of Starbucks. But this is actually really damaging. In fact, the shutdown of third places has been linked with negative mental health impacts across the board, and particularly among marginalized people. On the flip side though, people are spending a lot more time in their homes, which was quoted in Derek Thompson's article. He says, American homes are becoming larger and more inviting. There's less of a reason for people to leave their homes, particularly for those who have homes that can fulfill a number of different needs and desires that they otherwise would have had to have gone outside to get. In his article, he says, in the past few decades, the typical American home has become bigger, more comfortable, and more entertaining. From 1973 to 2023, the size of the average new single-family house increased by 50%, and the share of new single-family houses that have air conditioning doubled to 98%. Streaming services, video game consoles, and flat-screen TVs make the living room more diverting than any 20th century theatre or arcade. I just realised that my lovely lamp has been off this entire time. So sad. Anyway, you get it for the last 5 minutes of the video, so Woo! Small wins, small victories. To top it all off, I read this heinous quote. No, I'm actually not kidding. It made me feel unwell. Like, I felt queasy. I had to step away from the computer when I read this. Anyway, Derek Thompson then speaks with Clifton Harness, who's essentially a software designer who works on floor plans and the design for layouts of new developments. Harness said the following: "The cardinal rule of contemporary apartment design is that every room is built to accommodate maximal screen time. In design meetings with developers and architects, you have to assure everyone that there will be space for a wall-mounted flat-screen television in every room," he said. "It used to be, let's make sure our rooms have great light. But now, when the question is, how do we give the most comfort to the most people, the answer is to feed their screen addiction." Just excuse me while I actually go and throw up. The thing is also here is that this is one particular person in an industry, and I am presuming that this person works in the US. In fact, I'm confident that they do, and therefore this data cannot be extrapolated across the board at all. This person would work with particular developers who prioritize particular things. Not every development company is going to be doing this across the world at all. If we're so used to not spending time communicating with people that exist outside of our echo chambers and outside of our bubbles, and we're so not used to spending time with weaker Thai friends and meeting new people, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that people aren't doing it. Hard things are hard. They're not enjoyable when you first start doing it. And skills like being able to communicate with others need to be practiced. It's, again, not surprising that we're opting for phones in situations where we feel awkward or we don't know how to communicate with others, not only because it's hard to do so now because we're so used to being on our phones and so used to being in echo chambers online where you say something and then everyone says the same thing back at you, but also phones are addictive as well. It's not crazy that we're opting for phones rather than having a conversation. When I started to spend more time alone and to really start enjoying my own company, I actually ended up having a better relationship with myself, which then contributed to better conversations and connections with others, even where it was obvious that I had absolutely nothing in common with the person I was communicating with. When you start enjoying your own company and accepting yourself without judgment, you actually start to be less selective with the people you surround yourself with because you don't derive so much validation from their acceptance of you. If you accept yourself for who you are, you actually can engage with people that you might think actually disagree with you because you know that ultimately you agree with yourself. And I'm not talking about befriending bigots. Like, if someone says something bigoted in the first little while of our communication, I'm obviously not going to sit there and be like, interesting. That's not happening. Casual companionship where you actually don't have much to talk about can be really engaging and insightful, and you can learn a lot about different people and expand your perspective about the world in ways that I never would have done if I was just existing in my bubble back home. Ultimately, something needs to be done about mental health in general, and if things are being done about loneliness, that's really important, but we need to understand at its core what's actually happening here for the solutions to be truly effective. If you have the opportunity to sort of get to know yourself better, as lame as that sounds, I would highly, highly recommend it. And you don't need to go on a solo travel trip overseas or even anywhere in general other than your community. You could literally go on a solo date and start implementing that in your life, or take your laptop to a local cafe to do your work instead of doing it from home. I truly think the more things that you do alone, the more comfortable you get with yourself and the less lonely you ironically feel. But that's my personal experience. Ultimately, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd be really interested to know if you have experiences solo traveling or with loneliness, or what you think about the distinction between being alone and feeling lonely, whether or not you think there really is a loneliness epidemic, or if it's indicative of declining rates of mental health in general, or if you think it's just an increase in solitude as a lifestyle choice. As always, you can follow me on Instagram. I've been posting a lot more on there, and TikTok as well. And give this podcast a rating of 5 stars, please, if you enjoyed it. I know it only takes like 2 seconds of your day, but it actually really helps my podcast to be found, and then we can increase our community, which is really fun, and we love that. And like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me. And that is all I have to say.